Chapter 7. Xeloda. When planning for a national system of interstate highways began in the decade after World War II, a massive network of high-speed roads was envisioned. There would be east-west routes running from one coast to the other. There would be north-south routes stretching from the Canadian border to the southernmost regions of the southernmost states. They would be laid out across the continent in a grid of near horizontal and vertical stripes, and the system would allow travelers to move around the United States at unprecedented speeds. And in the midst of Cold War paranoia, the interstates were envisioned to have military uses as well. In the event of a domestic national emergency, long straight sections of interstate highway could be used as makeshift airfields. The interstates would allow for the rapid movement of military personnel and equipment. The road network would be named the Dwight D. Eisenhower National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. In the master plan, 3 north-south routes were proposed for the nation's territory east of the Mississippi River. There would be Interstate 95, which would run from Miami along the eastern seaboard all the way to central Maine and the Canadian border. Along its almost 2,000-mile stretch, I-95 would connect the cities of Miami, Jacksonville, Richmond, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City, and Boston. There would be I-65, which would connect Chicago to Indianapolis, and then Louisville, Nashville, Birmingham, and Mobile, Alabama. And in the middle there would be I-75, which would run from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan to Tampa Bay and beyond. To the dismay of Eisenhower and a lot of other people, when they were built, the interstates plowed through most of the cities they were designed to connect. I-95 ripped through Miami, Jacksonville, Richmond, and Philadelphia. I-65 divided Indianapolis, Nashville, Birmingham, and of course, Louisville. And when I-75 was built, one of the cities that it tore through was Detroit. As I-75 approaches Detroit from the south, it runs near the western shore of Lake Erie and then curves to the east, roughly following the path of the Detroit River that separates the city from Windsor, Ontario. It then twists and turns through the heart of the city, merging with I-94 and I-96 in an ugly mess of tangled interchanges that rival Louisville's Spaghetti Junction. One interchange eclipses the Detroit neighborhood of Mexicantown. As I-75 continues north, it runs atop Chrysler Drive, not far from the eastern edge of another neighborhood known as 8 Mile. Most who recognize the name 8 Mile know it, of course, as the title of a 2002 hip-hop drama film starring Eminem. The film tells Eminem's own story as he crosses over from the white world of suburban Detroit to the black world of hip-hop in the 8 Mile neighborhood. He did so physically as well as musically, and ironically, doing so required him to pass the site of an old barrier that now stands as a monument to enforced segregation, the Detroit 8 Mile Wall. It was constructed in 1941 to separate black and white homeowners. 8 Mile is the name of an east-west road that runs north of downtown Detroit, and during World War II it served as a line of demarcation between black and white families. Blacks lived south of the 8 Mile divide and whites to the north. It was to Detroit what the Rock River of my mother's youth was to Rockford, Illinois, and what the 9th Street divide still represents to Louisville. The Detroit 8 Mile Wall was a foot thick, 5 feet high, and a half-mile long. It was designed to be a physical barrier to keep blacks out of a white neighborhood. Racists love to build walls. It would be facile to blame all of Detroit's problems on the destruction caused by interstate construction, but it's still difficult to ignore the fact that I-75 tore up some of Detroit's poorest and most ethnic neighborhoods, and in so doing only made matters worse. Interstate construction did the same to cities all across the United States. The conclusion was difficult to avoid. There was something racist about the interstates. In 2007, our little consulting company landed a decent-sized contract with the state of Michigan. One of Michigan's state agencies decided to deploy some of our software to all of its offices that were scattered throughout the state. The project was going to be time-consuming and labor-intensive, and because we were so little, it fell to Carolyn and me to make it happen. Fortunately, I still had use of the little airplane, and so in September of 2007, we departed Louisville's Bowman Field for a whirlwind aerial tour of the entire state of Michigan. Our first stop was Detroit. We landed at Coleman A. Young International Airport, named for Detroit's first African-American mayor. Even though Coleman was a small field suitable only for general aviation, the international part of its name was more easily justified than was Louisville's Muhammad Ali International Airport, known then simply as Louisville International. From Louisville, you had to be wrapped inside a UPS package to fly out of the country. From Coleman, all you had to do was throw a few bucks at a bored flight instructor. He or she could then fly you in a little Cessna the few short miles over to Windsor, Ontario. After we landed at Coleman, we rented a car, grabbed a hotel room, and then headed in opposite directions. I drove Carolyn north to a client office in Macomb, a neighborhood just outside Detroit's city limits. Then I headed south to Connor Street, where an abandoned Catholic hospital had been turned into a civic center. To get to and from the office, I often had to pass through 8 Mile. I hadn't yet seen the film, but of course I'd heard of it and of the 8 Mile neighborhood's reputation. I still wasn't prepared for what I found. I pulled into a couple of gas stations and then right back out again because of what I saw going on there. Drug dealing in broad daylight, prostitution. When I got to our client's office, the manager told me that they'd recently gotten new computers because someone had broken into their office one weekend and stolen all of their old ones. When he called the police to report the theft, they asked, "Anybody shot?" "No," said the manager, and the cops told him, "Then we're not coming." Whenever we traveled on the customer's dime, particularly with government agencies, I always tried to be as frugal as I could with travel expenses. I'd ask for the smallest, cheapest rental car available, and I'd always waive the extra insurance. I figured that if something happened, the credit card I used would cover most of it. It was an idiotic thing to do. At Coleman, the rental car counter was low on inventory, so I was given a big fat-ass SUV for the price of a compact. At our client's office in the Civic Center, the office manager asked me if I'd parked in the lot in front of the center. Yes, I told him, and then he proceeded to tell me about the problems they'd had there. An office worker was leaving one day when he saw a driver bash into his parked car in the lot. The worker yelled at the driver. "Hey, you just hit my car," he hollered. "So what?" the other driver hollered back, and then he drove away. But the biggest problem was catalytic converter theft. Gangs would show up with auto mechanic crawlers and portable acetylene torches. In broad daylight, they'd crawl around the parking lot and help themselves to as many catalytic converters as they could cut free before they ran out of acetylene. The manager asked me what kind of a rental car I had, and when I told him that it was a fat-ass SUV, he said, "Whoa, you better watch out. Those are their favorites because they're so easy to crawl under." Shit. I spent the next 2 days running out to the parking lot every half hour to see if my fat-ass SUV had a smoldering undercarriage. I'm not sure what I'd have done if it had. But I was lucky, and when we left Detroit, I returned the fat-ass rental with its catalytic converter intact. Our next stop was Flint. I'd been anxious to visit Flint. It was famous for being the hometown of Michael Moore, among other things, and that made me curious. In spite of his occasional descents into demagoguery, I was a fan of Moore's films, and so of course I'd seen Roger and Me, the 1989 documentary that launched his career. The early part of the film is a biopic of Moore's life in much the same way as 8 Mile was for Eminem. What I saw in the film made me want to see Flint for myself. In Roger and Me, Moore attempts to confront Roger B. Smith, then the CEO of General Motors. In the 1980s, Smith decided to close a slew of GM manufacturing plants in the Flint area and move production to Mexico, and those closures began the town's descent into a hellscape of economic decay. Michael never manages to cross paths with Roger until the very end of the film, so he spends most of its runtime showcasing Flint's devastation. Between 1989, when the film was produced, and our visit in the fall of 2007, that devastation only got worse. Much, much worse. At roughly the same time that Roger Smith started shutting down Flint's GM factories, construction of Interstate 69 began tearing through the southern edge of downtown Flint. The construction was part of an I-69 extension that was bitterly opposed by environmentalists and conservatives alike. Environmentalists worried about ecological damage. Conservatives worried about money. The construction was an unfunded mandate, meaning that states would have to bear the cost, as there was no federal funding available. When I-69 crossed paths with I-475, which plowed through Flint on a north-south route when it was built in the 1970s, the result was another ugly interchange that eviscerated the area just 5 blocks from the center of town. On the commute to our client's office, we saw row after row of abandoned houses, just like Michael Moore had shown in his film. The office was tucked into the corner of an ugly, squat building a couple of miles southeast of downtown Flint. The building sat in the corner of a large lot that was also home to a shabby mall of sorts. Shabby without the chic. When we got to the office, we noticed a cabless and open semi-trailer parked nearby. People were shuffling up and down some steps that led into the back of the trailer, and so of course we wanted to know what was going on there. The workers in our client's office told us that the Flint police were using the trailer as a processing station for pimps, johns, hookers, and drug dealers. The jail was so overcrowded that there simply wasn't enough room to take the newly arrested downtown. The jail was a feature in one of the most grotesque scenes in Roger and Me. When crime became rampant as Flint's economy decayed, the city built a new and much larger jail to meet the increasing demands of incarceration. When the jail was ready for use, a grand opening party was held there. Couples could pay $100 to join the party, get mug shots and fingerprint cards, and then spend the night in an as-yet unused jail cell. It was an obscene exercise in class tourism, and Moore captured it perfectly in his film. 6 years after Roger and Me, the British singer-songwriter Jarvis Cocker of the band Pulp released a song that he'd written called Common People. The lyrics deliver a biting critique of class tourism, and Common People became the quintessential anthem of the 90s Britpop movement. A few of the lyrics go like this. You want to live like common people? You want to see whatever common people see? Want to sleep with common people? You want to sleep with common people like me? You'll never live like common people. You'll never do what common people do. You'll never fail like common people. You'll never watch your life slide out of view. Our visit to Flint was as thoroughly depressing as we'd expected it would be, but at least we didn't see any rabbits being decapitated and skinned on a tree for meat like Moore showed in his film. While writing this book, Carolyn and I re-watched Roger and Me, and we had to avert our gaze during that damned rabbit scene. When we found ourselves with a couple of free days during our Michigan tour, we decided to go visit Mackinac Island. We'd heard fun things about it, but when we tried to book a hotel room on the island, we were told that everything was full. We asked if something big was going on. Yes, the folks on the island told us something very big was going on. On Thursday, the 27th of September 2007, a debate was being held on Mackinac Island. A debate for all the Republicans who were aspiring to become President of the United States. Mackinac is a tiny island in Lake Huron that sits just east of I-75, where an interstate bridge connects Michigan's Upper Peninsula to the mainland. The island was once populated by Ojibwe, Odawa, and Ottawa Indians. Variants of the word Mackinac in the native languages of those people loosely translate to either Island of the Fudge Shops or Too Much Fudge. The natives of Mackinac were prescient people, and thus they knew that one day their tiny island would be overrun by European settlers, and that those settlers would eventually build a boulevard and line it with fudge shops. It's possible that some historians will take exception to my recounting of the island's history, but I'm standing by my assertions. We spent upwards of 72 full hours on Mackinac in that fall of 2007, and thus I feel as qualified as anyone to make pronouncements about its past. In any event, the island did in fact become overrun with fudge shops, and every season scores of tourists can be seen waddling into them to snag a little fudge. Or maybe a lot. Often the tourists emerge from the shops laden with boxes of the stuff and then waddle away, destined to become a few pounds heavier. We finally found a hotel on the southern end of the island that had had a last-minute cancellation. We managed to fill what was probably the very last vacancy on the whole damned island of Mackinac on that long weekend. And we were very probably going to be the only visitors on that whole damned island who weren't Republicans. Mere mortals who visit Mackinac have only one option to reach it. They take ferries that run from the Upper Peninsula in mainland Michigan to a harbor on Mackinac's southern coast. Very fortunately for us, we had an airplane, and Mackinac has an airport. After a short and turbulent flight, we landed at the little island's airfield to find it laden with expensive hardware. There were more biz jets on that airport ramp than I'd ever seen, except in Louisville at Kentucky Derby time. While I stood on the tarmac admiring one particularly beautiful private jet, a line guy walked up and said, "That's Fred Thompson's." "Really?" I asked, and then he pointed to another one, and that one's Rudy Giuliani's. Our little single-engine prop job of an airplane looked pretty silly on the tarmac with all of that gleaming 1% hardware. But we had still flown to Mackinac Island, and that was something that very few people are ever able to do. It made us feel very fortunate, because we were. Not long after my campaign ended, I quit blogging and diary keeping. It was too big a pain in the ass, and I was too lazy to keep up with it. While I was smack dab in the middle of writing this book, ChatGPT became a thing, and so I began using it to help me dust off my memory. While writing this chapter, I posed a query to ChatGPT. Write about the 2007 Republican presidential debate on Mackinac Island. Even though I typoed the word Mackinac, ChatGPT was unfazed. Here's how it responded. The 2007 Republican presidential debate on Mackinac Island was held on September 22, 2007, and was sponsored by the Michigan Republican Party. The debate featured 9 Republican candidates, including Mitt Romney, John McCain, and Rudy Giuliani. The candidates discussed various issues such as tax policy, health care, and the war in Iraq. The debate was notable for its setting on Mackinac Island, which is known for its car-free policy and horse-drawn carriages. The island's unique atmosphere added a distinctive flavor to the debate, with candidates arriving by ferry and traveling by horse-drawn carriage to the Grand Hotel where the debate was held. The event was well received by both the candidates and the audience, with many praising the island's beauty and unique charm. Ultimately, the debate helped shape the course of the 2008 Republican primary and provided a memorable moment in American political history. I had to smile when I read the phrase, "candidates arriving by ferry." We knew better. Of course, then I had to ask ChatGPT some more questions. Here's how it went. Me. Did Fred Thompson fly to Mackinac Island for the 2007 Republican presidential debate, or did he take a ferry? ChatGPT. There is no definitive answer as to how Fred Thompson arrived to Mackinac Island for the 2007 Republican presidential debate, as different sources provide different accounts. Some reports indicate that he flew to the island on a private plane, while others suggest that he took a ferry. However, it is worth noting that the island has a unique transportation policy that prohibits most motor vehicles, including airplanes, so ferry service is the most common way for visitors to travel to the island. In any case, Thompson did participate in the debate, which was held on September 22, 2007, and was sponsored by the Michigan Republican Party. Me. Did Rudy Giuliani fly to Mackinac Island for the 2007 Republican presidential debate, or did he take a ferry? ChatGPT. Rudy Giuliani flew to Mackinac Island for the 2007 Republican presidential debate rather than taking a ferry. While the island has a unique transportation policy that prohibits most motor vehicles, including airplanes, exceptions are sometimes made for high-profile events and VIPs. According to news reports at the time, Giuliani arrived on the island via a chartered plane that was allowed to land at the nearby Mackinac County Airport. His arrival and subsequent participation in the debate were widely covered by the media, as he was then considered one of the frontrunners for the Republican nomination. ChatGPT was wrong about the name of the airport. Mackinac County Airport is a small field located on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan near the town of St. Ignace. The correct name of the airfield on Mackinac is Mackinac Island Airport. I asked ChatGPT about one more candidate. Me. Did John McCain fly to Mackinac Island for the 2007 Republican presidential debate, or did he take a ferry? ChatGPT. According to news reports, John McCain took a ferry to Mackinac Island for the 2007 Republican presidential debate rather than flying there. The island has a unique transportation policy that prohibits most motor vehicles, including airplanes, so ferry service is the most common way for visitors to travel to the island. McCain's arrival by ferry was widely covered by the media, and he later joked during the debate that he had traveled by land and sea to attend. I asked ChatGPT one last question about that Mackinac weekend. How did the candidates who attended the 2007 debate on Mackinac Island rank in the polls at the time of the debate? Here's how it responded. At the time of the 2007 Republican presidential debate on Mackinac Island, the candidates' rankings in the polls varied. However, based on the average of national polls in September 2007, the ranking of the candidates who attended the debate were as follows. 1. Rudy Giuliani. 2. Fred Thompson. 3. John McCain. 4. Mitt Romney. 5. Mike Huckabee. 6. Ron Paul. 7. Tom Tancredo. 8. Duncan Hunter. 9. Sam Brownback. It's worth noting that these rankings were subject to change, and the debate itself may have influenced voters' perceptions of the candidates and their standings in the polls. I had to smile again when I read ChatGPT's sentence about rankings and perceptions. In our wildest dreams, none of us could have imagined then how those rankings and perceptions were going to change in the months and years that followed the Mackinac Island debate. After we landed, Carolyn and I took a horse-drawn carriage from the airport to our hotel. It was the only way to get there, and it was a very unique experience, to say the least, to get out of an airplane and into a carriage. But that's a part of what makes Mackinac a fun place. The other part, of course, is fudge. When I was a kid, one of my favorite TV shows was Combat, a drama about American soldiers in World War II. The soldiers were ostensibly in the Normandy area of France not long after the invasion, and of course in nearly every episode they would go on a patrol and manage to get themselves into a desperate situation, practically surrounded by German soldiers. And of course they always managed to fight their way out of their jam, but not before one of the soldiers was heard to exclaim, "This place is crawling with Krauts!" Being on Mackinac Island that weekend in September of 2007 made me feel like I was in a Bizarro World episode of Combat. I kept saying to Carolyn, "Man, this place is crawling with Republicans," until she grew tired of me and told me to shut up. The island was indeed crawling with Republicans, and some of them were simply nauseating. You couldn't help but overhear their vacuous conversations about nothing because they were everywhere. On the horse-drawn carriages, in the fudge shops, on the sidewalks. Once a guy walked past us carrying a large boombox on his shoulder. He was blasting a version of Frank Sinatra's New York, New York, only when it was time for the New York, New York part, the singer belted out, "Ron Paul, Ron Paul." It was disgusting. At breakfast one morning in our hotel, a woman started babbling about Newt Gingrich, only she didn't know who he was. She was telling her breakfast companion about this guy she kept seeing on TV and about how much sense he made with his every pronouncement, but she couldn't remember his name. "Dewey something?" she asked her companion, and then somebody corrected her. "Newt, that's it," she exclaimed. "Newt Gingrich." I wanted to throw a pancake at her. I even picked one up and made a subtle threatening motion, but then I looked at Carolyn. She was shaking her head, so I put the pancake down and ate it instead. We weren't really interested in all the Republican goings-on that weekend, so instead we rented a tandem bike and rode around the perimeter of the island. Multiple times because it was so easy to do. The weather was nice, and we had a picnic on one ride, and we had a wonderful time. The sadness of Detroit and Flint began to fade. Shortly before we left, while we were walking past a restaurant on a quiet street, two men emerged. One of them was wearing a hat and carrying a briefcase. The man was Mark McKinnon, although at the time I didn't know who he was. The other man was John McCain. "Shit," I said to Carolyn, "that's John McCain." He and McKinnon were walking all alone with no one else around. Of course I had to go foist myself on him. I walked right up to McCain and said, "Hey there, John, hang in there, buddy. Good luck to you." He turned and smiled and said, "Why, thank you." I shook his hand and patted him on the shoulder. I was struck by how bony it felt. The poor guy spent years strung up by his thumbs in the Hanoi Hilton, I remember thinking, and some of what I felt in his shoulder had to be a consequence of that. By the fall of 2007, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton had both declared their candidacies, but I really liked John McCain, and I decided that if he were to become the President of the United States, I wouldn't mind at all. There were plenty of policy issues on which we disagreed, but John McCain was a principled man and a hero, and I greatly admired him. We left Mackinac Island very happy. We'd had some nice bike rides, a nice picnic. I'd eaten a lot of fudge. Too much fudge. Carolyn hadn't. She's far too reasonable to waste her fun calories on something as dumb as fudge. I'm not. But best of all, I'd gotten to shake John McCain's hand. Shortly after that weekend, a connecting rod broke loose in the engine that was Rudy Giuliani's mind, and he stopped banging on all 8 cylinders. He dropped in the polls. So did Fred Thompson. We didn't know it then, but John McCain was about to surge into the lead, and he would become the 2008 Republican nominee for President of the United States. "Have you been sick?" Shortly after we finished our Michigan tour, a nurse asked me that question during a routine exam. No, I told her I wasn't. I wanted to know why she asked me that. Because your white blood count is too high. A few tests later, I found out why. I had leukemia. Chronic lymphocytic leukemia, CLL for short. Something had gone haywire in my immune system, and it was now cranking out more lymphocytes than it was supposed to. Lymphocytes are a type of white blood cell, and CLL makes the body produce far more of them than it needs. It's as though your body is fighting an infection that isn't there. Needless to say, the diagnosis came as a surprise. I was 51 years old. 50-something people aren't supposed to get CLL. It's a 70-something disease. I was mystified. I wondered what was going to happen next. But more than that, I wondered how the hell it had happened. When I talked to friends about it, I found no shortage of theories. A composite sample. Vegan. It's because you eat meat. Me. I don't eat meat, only fish. Vegan. It's because you eat fish and cheese. Evangelical. It's because you're an atheist. Me, I'm not an atheist. I'm a muddled agnostic. Evangelical, it's because your faith isn't strong enough. Maybe one of them was right. Maybe they both were. Or maybe a few molecules of toluene diisocyanate managed to waft their way past the breathing apparatus I was wearing at a chemical plant one day. Maybe a few particles of cesium grossness from Chernobyl found their way onto a potato in Germany while I was living there, and I ate the potato. Maybe I stumbled onto a bag of Agent Orange on a military base somewhere. A lot of Vietnam vets who'd been exposed to Agent Orange were getting CLL. Maybe it's because my father brought home a bottle of Roundup from Kmart sometime in the 1970s. Or maybe a random gamma ray from a distant galaxy struck planet Earth right where I was standing, and it crushed a bit of my bone marrow. Maybe it was because all of those things happened. Who knows? We have no chance to ever know the why of such things, but that doesn't stop people from pretending that they do. I considered how lucky I was. I had no physical symptoms. I just had a piece of paper that said my blood chemistry was all messed up. My buddy Brooke Pardew's husband Tom wasn't so lucky. I found out that he had CLL too, and that it was causing him constant misery. He was in the midst of chemotherapy, the only way in 2007 to treat the disease when it caused problems. Blast the body with poison chemicals, knock back the lymphocytes for a while, repeat as necessary, until you can't anymore. Don't let your health insurance lapse, my rich doctor brother-in-law told me. He had a point. That little card was now the most valuable piece of plastic in my wallet. By this time, Michael Moore's Sicko had been released, and of course we'd watched it. The scenes where even well-insured people were denied coverage were frightening. Would that happen to me? One segment featured a doctor standing in front of Humana's headquarters in downtown Louisville. Humana's building is one of the more prominent features of Louisville's skyline. It's big and marbly and ostentatious. A lot of us call it the Ministry of Truth. The Humana doctor and sicko stood in front of the Ministry of Truth and described how her job was to deny the claims of sick people with Humana insurance. The doctor who denied the most claims was paid a bonus, she said. Garrett Adams was right. Of course he was. I was now a member of the Cancer Club, along with my mother, along with a lot of people I knew. My mother was a double breast cancer survivor. So was Stephanie Horn. About the same time as my diagnosis, it was discovered that my mother's second bout with breast cancer had metastasized onto her liver. Some worrisome spots had appeared, and she was receiving an oral treatment. But it seemed to be slow growing, and she was doing okay. But like me, she had a ticking time bomb inside of her. Carolyn and I decided to take off to Montreal for a while. We'd bought a place there a few years earlier so that she could be closer to her friends and family, and we found ourselves spending more and more time there. Montreal is an infinitely interesting city, even if it is a bit dysfunctional. It's a little like your drunk uncle, lovable when sober but a pain in the ass when not. In Montreal's character, there's a little bit of New York and a little bit of Paris, but mostly the city has a personality all its own. Its bilingualism is one reason why. I've never been in another city where I found so many truly bilingual people as there are in Montreal. And I don't just mean people who speak two languages, I mean people who have two native languages. A lot of folks in Montreal speak both English and French without a trace of an accent in either. When they speak English, you'd never know that they're just as fluent in French. The standard greeting when walking into a Montreal shop is bonjour, hi, and that's your invitation to continue in whichever language suits your fancy. It's not unusual to hear groups of kids on the subway babbling along in French until some random word triggers a switch, and then they start babbling away in English without skipping a beat. Eventually, something else triggers a switch back to French. The process is apparently transparent to them. They don't even seem to be aware of which language they're using. It's fascinating. Because of its varied architecture and relatively low production costs, Montreal is a favorite venue for filmmaking. The province of Quebec heavily subsidizes its film industry and the arts in general in order to promote French-language culture, and the ready availability of skilled film crews and sophisticated production equipment is attractive to American filmmakers as well. It's not uncommon to stumble upon a tournage where a bit of Montreal has been transformed into a New York or Paris street scene. While I was writing this book in the summer of 2022, a production crew for the film Scream 6 descended on our neighborhood. I had no idea that there could be that many screams. Of course, we had to wander over to the film set to see what was going on, and when we got there, we saw that the corner of Rue Sherbrooke and Avenue Oxford in Montreal had been transformed into the corner of 45th Street and 4th Avenue in New York, complete with a fake subway entrance, a USA Today paper box, and a line of yellow cabs. The production crew were getting ready to film a night scene, but we quickly grew bored waiting for something to happen. About 90% of filmmaking seems to involve standing around and waiting for something to happen. We left before they rolled their cameras, and we never saw Courtney Cox. We got over it. In 2007, one of the few things happening in the American political world besides Mackinac Island was the election of Kentucky's governor. The incumbent was a Republican named Ernie Fletcher, who wasn't particularly popular, but who was running for re-election anyway. He was so weak that the newly dethroned Ann Northup felt emboldened to challenge him in the Republican primary. Another guy named Steve Pence joined the fray. There's no evidence that Steve is related to the Mike Pence guy across the river in Indiana. Steve Pence was a former Republican lieutenant governor who happened to be married to a friend of my sister's. In Kentucky, the 6 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon principle is generally shrunk down to a degree or two. Fletcher's weakness was the result of some shady hiring practices he'd engaged in. He was even convicted of a misdemeanor for his shadiness, but then he pardoned himself, which ruffled lots of feathers. Nevertheless, Fletch survived his primary challenge. The final score was Fletcher 50, Northup 34, and Pence 16. Because of Fletcher's weakness, a bunch of Democrats started clamoring for a shot at him as well, and early in the year I got an offer and a half from a couple of them to be their running mate for lieutenant governor. A woman called me and explained that she was considering a run, and would I like to be her running mate? At the time I've heard of her, but I can no longer remember her name. ChatGPT was no help, and neither was Jeff Noble, whose encyclopedic knowledge of Kentucky politics is unmatched. In any event, I politely declined. I'd had enough of hopeless campaigns. She ended up not running anyway. The half offer came from a guy named Steve Henry. Henry was a former 2-term lieutenant governor, and he was married to Heather French Henry, a former Miss America. Henry had gotten himself into a couple of sticky wickets a la Fletcher. He was an orthopedic surgeon, and some questions surfaced about his Medicare and Medicaid billing practices while he was on the faculty of the University of Louisville Medical School. Apparently he tried to bill for some bloodletting procedures, but Medicare disallowed the charges. I just made that part up. In any event, Henry eventually repaid the feds $162,000. He also had to reimburse the Commonwealth of Kentucky a few grand for expenses like travel to beauty pageants while he was lieutenant governor. Sometime in the spring of 2007, a woman named Kimberly Greenwell, who I knew from the Metro Democratic Club, arranged for me to have lunch with her and Steve Henry. I had no idea why, but I didn't care. Steve Henry was an intriguing guy, and I wanted to meet him. At lunch he seemed distracted, but he still managed to communicate his plans to run for governor. At some point Kimberly asked him, "Who are you thinking about for a running mate?" "I don't know," Henry said, and then he looked at me. "What are you doing?" he asked. I'm busy," I told him. I had no desire to get involved in any of that. By then I'd seen enough of what it was like to be a real candidate, and I didn't really like what I'd seen. I knew that I'd never run for office again. Even when an opening popped up for County Commissioner District C where I lived, I took a pass. My days as a candidate were over. Henry eventually chose a woman named Renee True to be his running mate. She was the Fayette County Property Valuation Administrator, the area that surrounds Lexington. In the Democratic primary that year, Steve and Renee got their butts kicked. They finished a distant third with a little over 17% of the vote. Of course, while writing these paragraphs, I had to ask ChatGPT about Steve Henry, and its responses astounded me. I asked it, "Write about Steve Henry, who contemplated running for Kentucky governor." ChatGPT wrote a few glowing paragraphs about Henry's political career and his commitment to improving health care access and reducing the costs of prescription drugs. There was no mention at all of his Medicare and travel expense problems. Then ChatGPT threw this curveball at me. Henry ultimately decided not to enter the race for governor. He cited personal reasons for his decision, including the health of his wife, former Kentucky Secretary of State and current mayor of Louisville, Jerry Abramson. Wow. You can't make this shit up. But ChatGPT can. Heather French Henry did in fact run for Kentucky Secretary of State as a Democrat in 2019, but she was beaten in the general election. And there had been rumors around Louisville for years that the mayor for life was gay. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Everyone in town had heard the rumors, but most of us dismissed them as the kind of general dumbness that confronts almost everyone who dares to walk the mean streets of politics. But ChatGPT's convolution of reality was some next-level dumbness. I decided that it was time to bail out of its bizarro alternate universe and to find better ways to hunt down the information that I needed for this book. Thank God we'll always have Wikipedia and Jeff Noble. In Kentucky's 2007 general election, Ernie Fletcher faced a rematch with a Democrat named Steve Beshear, whom he'd beaten in 2003. On November 6, 2007, Beshear got his revenge. The final score was Beshear 59, Fletcher 41. Apparently, a self-pardon is a really bad idea. Xeloda? Xeloda, my mother told me on the phone. The spots on her liver were worsening, and she was being prescribed a newer, stronger oral medication to fight them. Xeloda, it was called. I should have asked her how to spell it. While I was on the phone with her, I did a quick search of the internets for Xeloda with a Z, but found nothing, of course. I'll always curse Big Pharma for the cute names it loves to give its products. I was in a bit of a hurry that day, and I resolved to hunt down the drug and research it. But it was an oral medication. How bad could that be? As it turned out, it could be very bad. Incredibly, horribly bad. A few days later, I got a call from my sister. Ma was in the hospital. Dehydration. She was being given IV fluids, and she was doing better. She'd be out in a day or two, my sister told me. I said fine. Carolyn and I started making preparations to go back to Kentucky to spend Christmas with my mother. Then I got another phone call from my sister. In the middle of the night. Xeloda had burned a hole in Ma's small intestine. She'd had emergency surgery. She was in critical condition. We hurriedly packed our bags and left Montreal. We'd flown the little plane there, and fortunately there was a weather window that would allow us to get back to Kentucky quickly. Quicker than what the airlines could do. But to reach the plane we had to drive to Highgate Springs, Vermont, just across the U.S.-Canadian border. We kept the plane there because it was too big a pain in the ass to fly it across the border. Not into Canada, though. It was flying back to the U.S. that was a pain in the ass. Before 9/11, both countries had pre-clearance programs for small aircraft and boats. Once approved, we could usually get clearance to enter either country with a simple phone call. But the U.S. shit-canned their program after 9/11. The Canadians didn't. I drove us across the border in our old Volvo. I loved that car. I spent the drive to Vermont thinking about it as a way to distract myself from worry. I'd bought it in 1992 when I moved to D.C., and it was the best $4,000 I ever spent on a car. Mine was an 84 240 DL wagon, and of course it was maroon, like all real 1980s Volvos were. It had a 4-speed manual transmission, but it had a magic economy button at the end of the stick shift. Pressing it would change the way that the Volvo's gears shifted, and the result was better fuel economy. The button gave me a de facto 5th gear. The Volvo had a lambda-son system for precise control of the air-fuel ratio in the engine, and that meant lower emissions than most of its 1980s peers. All of that worked perfectly when I bought the car in 1992, but this was 2007. Almost nothing worked anymore. When I started leaving the plane in Vermont, I made a deal with the airplane mechanics on the field. I gave them the Volvo. Use it for whatever you want, I told them. Just let me have it back once in a while when I fly in. That was fine with them. A lot of little airports keep an old car around for just such purposes. Sometimes the courtesy car sits on the field with the keys in the ignition, and anybody is welcome to use it. The protocol is just to leave some gas in it for the next guy. But by 2007, my Volvo was 23 years old. One of the windshield wipers quit working, so an airplane mechanic attached a bar to it and bolted the other end to the wiper that was still working. The body was beginning to be eaten by rust. The magic economy button no longer worked its magic. The exhaust smelled terrible. My old Volvo was dying. When we'd left D.C. to move back to Louisville, Carolyn and I had loaded up that old Volvo like we were the Beverly Hillbillies. It was so loaded down that sometimes, on the mountainous sections of I-64 in West Virginia, we could barely make 35 miles an hour uphill. But we made it. We were in a hurry to get to Louisville then, too. My mother had had bradycardic arrhythmia, a too low heart rate. My neighbor called once and told me that she'd found my mother lying under a tree. My mother got a pacemaker, but only after she passed out one day and we were able to capture her arrhythmia on a monitor she'd been given. Without the data from the monitor, Medicare said they wouldn't pay for the pacemaker. But we got the data and she got the pacemaker. She was fine again. She could survive anything, I thought. But she was 83 years old now, and a noxious chemotherapy drug had just burned a hole inside her. My mother was dying. Once we got to the airport in Vermont, we had to chip a half-inch of ice off the wings of the airplane before we could fly away. Ice is the enemy of aerodynamics. Even a small amount of it can turn a well-designed airfoil into a glorified ice cube, and ice cubes don't fly very well. In flight, the physics are simple. Fly in visible moisture in temperatures below freezing, and you'll get ice. $60 million airliners have sophisticated systems to clear away ice in flight. $60,000 bug smashers don't. And sometimes even $60 million airliners can get into trouble when they encounter ice. But we were lucky. We were able to stay out of the clouds all the way from Vermont to Kentucky. 1,000 miles in 7 hours. One fuel stop. No ice. When we got to the hospital, my mother had a breathing tube in her throat. Her tongue had swollen. She had to have a tracheotomy. She was suffering terribly. She told me that she wanted to die, but at the same time she fought. She fought and she began to recover. Nothing was going to kill my mother, I told myself. Nothing could. Of course I knew that none of us are going to get out of this thing alive, but I always thought that an exception would be made in her case. A world without my mother in it was inconceivable to me. There was talk of moving her back home, but then the old enemy arrived. The enemy that kills almost everyone who stays in a hospital too long. Pneumonia. When Carolyn and I arrived at the hospital on the morning of December 27, 2007, all the TV screens bolted to the walls of the hospital were showing the assassination of Benazir Bhutto. On that same day, my mother died. But she didn't die of cancer, even though that's what her death certificate says. Benazir Bhutto was killed by an assassin's bullets and a bomb. My mother was killed by a drug called Xeloda. Grief has to be the worst form of human suffering, especially grief that's caused by a death that ends the bond between a mother and her child. There is no other bond like it in the natural world. A giant hole opens inside of you, and all color drains away. You do something, anything for distraction. Anything to chase away the pain, even for a few seconds. It's the only thing that helps. And then slowly, far too slowly, the hole starts to fill back up again. But it never completely does. Colors start to return, but some of them stay faded, and some of them never return at all. There is no such thing as closure. The world is now just a different place than it used to be, and you have to learn to live in it. The old world that you knew is gone, and it will never be back. When I was a kid in the 3rd grade, about a year after JFK died, I came home from school with an assignment. I needed to memorize a poem to recite in class. I asked my mother what I should do. She thought for a second, and then she suggested that we try Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. She explained to me that Robert Frost was one of America's most beloved poets, and that JFK asked him to read a poem at his inauguration. I sat with my mother that evening and we memorized Frost's Woods poem together. I can still recite it from memory all these years later. I want to recite it here, now. I could ask ChatGPT to write it for me, but I don't want that damn thing to do it. I want to write it myself, just as I remember it when my mother taught it to me. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. When we finished memorizing it, my mother asked me if I knew why the last line of the poem was a repetition of the one before it. No, I told her I didn't. Then she explained to me how the penultimate line can be taken literally. The speaker is in the middle of the woods, she told me, and he has a long way to go to get home. And the last line, my mother explained, was figurative. The speaker is in the middle of his life, she said, and he has a long way to go before he can be laid to his rest. It was a profound lesson for an 8-year-old. My mother loved poetry, and because of her, so do I. I threw myself into distractions. I made a memorial website, helenmoore.org, just some simple HTML and a few old family pictures. My mother loved Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River anthology, and so I put the same epitaph on her website that Masters' family had inscribed on his tombstone. It's from a poem he wrote called "Tomorrow is My Birthday." Good friends, let's to the fields. I have a fever. After a little walk, and by your pardon, I think I'll sleep. There is no sweeter thing, nor fate more blessed than to sleep. Here, world, I pass you like an orange to a child. I can no more with you. Do what you will. I made a second website, XelodaKilledMyMother.org. On the site I wrote about how Xeloda was really a chemical compound called capecitabine, and about what that chemical had done to my mother. I started getting a smattering of emails from people all around the world. People who'd lost someone they loved because Xeloda had killed them. They only wrote because they were looking for someone to help them share their anguish. They hadn't yet learned that we can share happiness, but we can't share sadness. Sadness is the loneliest feeling there is. Capecitabine helped most of the people who took it, I conceded on the website, but it killed many others. Modern medicine had become an industry of probabilities. When my mother was confronted with a growing metastasis, she wondered aloud if maybe she shouldn't just let nature take its course. She was, after all, 83. But I urged her to give the new pills a try without fully comprehending the risks that those new pills brought with them. I only learned about those risks after she died, and that knowledge has brought with it a sorrow that I will carry to my own grave. By the spring of 2008, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were duking it out to be the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. At the same time, my 86-64 buddy Ken Herndon became politically restless. Having spent 5 years sitting on his ass as the elected yet powerless Jefferson County Judge Executive, Ken decided that he wasn't having much fun anymore. He wanted to run for Louisville Metro Council. I badly needed distractions, and so I volunteered to work for Ken, and I began to pay close attention to the battle between Barack and Hillary. Ken's problem was that he lived in the same council district as the incumbent Democrat, the well-known and universally loved George Unseld. George was the brother of Wesley, and he'd been a fine basketball player in his own right. In college, he was a star center for the University of Kansas, and he was drafted by the LA Lakers. But he wasn't quite NBA caliber like his brother was. After a short stint in the fledgling American Basketball Association in the early 60s, George returned to Louisville. He became a teacher and the basketball coach at his old high school and mine, Seneca. In the early years of high school, we were forced to take a physical education class, and George was our teacher. They made us play stupid games like dodgeball and kickball. There was boxing and even square dancing. I don't think that George had much influence over the curriculum. Once in the locker room after class, some kid decided that it would be fun to unload a bottle of pepper spray. The peppery dust quickly coated our throats, and we all stumbled out of the locker room, half naked and gasping for breath. "Who did that?" we heard George roar. He was a very big man with a very big voice. A few kids pointed at the perpetrator, and George grabbed him by the neck and brought the offender's face to within an inch of his own. "You better pray to the Lord for mercy, 'cause I ain't gonna give you none," George said to the terrified boy. I can no longer remember what happened to that hapless kid, but I can never forget the sound of George's voice. By 2008, George had been a member of Louisville's council for 9 years. He was only 64, but he was having health problems, and he privately told Ken that he didn't plan to run for re-election. Ken took that as a green light to run for George's seat, and he filed the requisite papers. At the last minute, George had a change of heart, and he decided to run for re-election after all. George's decision left a lot of us feeling rather conflicted, but I decided to stick with Ken's campaign anyway. There were, however, some within the local Democratic Party who were not at all conflicted. They were stridently opposed to Ken's candidacy, and a couple of well-placed Democrats perpetrated an appalling smear campaign against him. The night before the primary, I got a call from Ken. "Have you seen the flyer?" he asked. "What flyer?" I wanted to know. Ken is openly gay, and someone had photoshopped his head onto the body of a bare-chested and heavily tatted marcher in one of San Francisco's gay pride parades. Whoever created the flyer did a lousy job. It was laughably crude. Yet a copy of it was delivered to almost every resident in Ken's Metro Council district the day before the election. Ken had no time to issue an effective denial that the man in the picture was even him, as if that even mattered. The flyer also contained some horrible sentences about Jeff Noble, who was Ken's most valuable campaign volunteer. Jeff is also openly gay, and the flyer smeared him with some vicious language that I won't bother repeating because it isn't worth repeating. On primary day, we all scattered to different precincts to wait for the election results to be posted. A few minutes after the polls closed at 6, an election official would tape a piece of paper to the now locked door of the polling station showing the precinct's results. We called him into Ken, who was running his campaign out of his house. We all gathered there to tally the numbers, and when I arrived, I could see the frowns on Ken's and Jeff's faces. A total of 4,074 votes were cast. Ken lost by 121 votes. We'll never know how many, if any, of those 121 votes were influenced by that awful flyer. We were all sure who was behind it, but I'm not going to bother revealing their names here because it no longer matters. One of them is now dead, and the other has been reduced to political irrelevance. But the whole episode was grotesque. It was a vicious kind of Democrat-on-Democrat violence, and it just wasn't the way we treated each other, particularly not in a place like Louisville. To stay connected with my political buddies, I started hanging out fairly often at the weekly gatherings of Drinking Liberally, one of the groups that I'd gotten to know during my campaign. Drinking Liberally is a national organization comprised of left-wing pinko communists, run-of-the-mill liberals, and an assortment of other disaffected left-leaning political groupies. It was founded in 2003 by a couple of guys in a Hell's Kitchen New York bar, and now there are hundreds of chapters all across the United States. Members don't do much of anything except drink beer and bitch about how awful the wingnuts of the right can be. It was a sort of barroom Lincoln project. It was my kind of organization. The Louisville chapter had a core of about a dozen regulars, augmented by another dozen or so who occasionally showed up to our barroom meetups. It was rare for anyone else to join us, but one evening we found an unfamiliar face sitting at our table. It belonged to a young woman named Lindsay Wright, and she'd just moved to Louisville after taking a job with PETA. The animal rights group had dispatched her to town so that she could harass KFC in its own backyard. Lindsay was a Sarah Lawrence grad, and she was quiet and cerebral. As it turned out, she'd rented an apartment just a block away from our house, and we became friends and started hanging out once in a while. Naturally, Lindsay's presence attracted a flock of vegans to her side, and sometimes we'd go to parties with her. Poor vegans, they tried mightily, but their baked good in those days all tasted like ass. When we met Lindsay, I just bought a copy of King Corn, the documentary film that outlines how high-fructose corn syrup is killing us all. Lindsay told me that she'd always wanted to see it, so I invited her to watch it with us. My favorite moment in the movie comes when an Iowa farmer says, with a big smile on his face, "We're not growing corn, we're growing crap." The film roundly condemned the entire industrial corn business, and we all, including Lindsay, found it fascinating. I liked Lindsay, in part because she was intellectually curious, but I discovered that I wasn't particularly fond of PETA. In 2008, there was a very large KFC franchise restaurant in the middle of the hippy-dippy highlands on Bardstown Road about 2.5 miles north of the Bambi Bar. Few Bambi walkers ever made it that far, even if they were in dire need of some greasy chicken to soak up all the liquor they'd downed. Lindsay rented a small and dilapidated office space that faced the KFC restaurant, and she plastered its windows with pictures of bloody chickens. Just a short distance away lay Cave Hill Cemetery, a beautiful park-like space where many of Louisville's most famous sons and daughters are spending eternity. When we were kids, my mother used to take my sister and me to Cave Hill to feed the swans. A lot of families did that. One of the scenes in Elizabethtown was filmed there, showing Orlando Bloom and Kirsten Dunst smiling and laughing as they pranced through the rows of headstones. Cave Hill is Louisville's version of Père Lachaise. Muhammad Ali would eventually be buried there, and in 2008, Colonel Harlan Sanders already was. Lindsay arranged for the purchase of a gravesite that was only a short distance away from the Colonel's giant monument. It must have cost a lot because that section of Cave Hill was prime real estate. Lindsay bought a headstone and inscribed it with the name of Matt Prescott, one of her PETA colleagues who was still very much alive. For an epitaph, Lindsay had a poem etched on the stone. "Kind friend of chickens, today we honor your memory. Our love for you continues. Rest in peace. Those suffering and unable to move, remember you, each one striving for salvation. Brother, in us as in you, remain dreams for the souls of the voiceless." Lindsay submitted the headstone for approval, as was required by the cemetery, and once she received permission, the headstone was placed on Prescott's grave. Naturally, the PETA website immediately ballyhooed that the first letter of each line in the epigraph spelled KFC tortures birds. A very embarrassed Cave Hill forced PETA to remove the headstone, but their mission had been accomplished. The pictures of bloody chickens didn't really bother me, nor did the Cave Hill stunt. Most of us thought that the headstone gag was actually kind of fun. But PETA operated under the premise that any publicity is good publicity, and some of their shenanigans went a bit too far. Some of them went way too far. In August of 2008, a mentally ill man stabbed a fellow passenger to death on a bus that was traveling near the town of Portage-la-Prairie, Manitoba. The details of the attack were horrific, and news of it spread like wildfire throughout Canada. PETA declared on its website that the vicious murder was comparable to what chickens suffer when they're commercially slaughtered. They announced that they intended to say so in an ad that they were going to place in a Manitoba newspaper. But Canadians really are Americans with a conscience, and the backlash against PETA's plans was overwhelming. Throwing red paint on some movie star's fur coat is one thing, exploiting a man's death and a family's anguish is something else entirely. For once, PETA was forced to back down. Lindsay didn't stay in town for very long. PETA had other plans for her, and after a few months in Louisville, she headed west to Oakland. Before she left, during one of our discussions, I made a bet with her. I can no longer remember what it was about, something probably about my ability to get her into the corporate offices of Yum Brands. In any event, I lost the bet, and my debt was to have been to dress up in a giant chicken suit and parade around the hippy-dippy highlands, handing out seditious PETA literature. Fortunately for me, Lindsay never made me pay up. The 2008 primary battle between Barack and Hillary for the Democratic presidential nomination started out as quite a slugfest. Barack took the early lead on points, but then Hillary came back and gut-punched him in states like Ohio, Texas, and Pennsylvania. It was a fun contest to watch. Kentucky is way down the pecking order of presidential politics, and by the time its primary rolls around in May, the game is usually over. But in 2008 it was not, and both candidates made visits to Louisville to rally their bases. Obama spoke on May 14, 2008 at the Louisville Convention Center. We tried to go, but it was such a zoo that we were turned away. Hillary had spoken at the same venue a week earlier, but we didn't bother with her. We did see her, however, while walking in the hippy-dippy highlands. Her Kentucky campaign headquarters were housed in a shabby building on Bardstown Road, along the route of the Bambi Walk and not far from Lindsay's favorite KFC restaurant. A lot of Democratic campaigns rented that same space. By 2008, we'd finally sold the old family house in Jeffersontown, and moved to the Highlands, where we'd always wanted to live. We sold the house to a family of Cuban immigrants. A guy named Rosendo Estrada responded to an ad I'd posted on Zillow. He was looking for a house for his youngest brother. Within 30 seconds of my first conversation with Rosendo, I sensed that I was dealing with a very intelligent man. It turned out that I was right. Rosendo had a PhD in biochemistry. He'd escaped Cuba a decade earlier, and now he was doing research for a biotech firm in Louisville. One by one, he worked to get all his siblings out of Cuba. After his brother bought our old house, we became friends with the whole family, and we invited each other to parties. By coincidence, one of those parties happened on the same day that President Barack Obama visited Cuba in 2016, the first time a sitting president had visited the country since 1928. The iconic image of Air Force One, that giant 747, floating over the rooftops of Havana was a beautiful sight to me, and not just because I was an airplane buff. I couldn't help but think about how far we'd come since the old duck-and-cover missile crisis days of the early 60s. We've eaten a lot of great Cuban food with Rosendo's family. He and Carolyn always have a lot to talk about, as they're both fairly serious cyclists. Rosendo Estrada is a hell of a man. Hillary's Louisville entourage briefly filled the streets of the Highlands with black SUVs. Obama's youthful army filled its Irish bars. On the night of the Kentucky primary, Hillary came out on top 66-30. Her win gave her 37 Kentucky delegates to Obama's 14. But less than 3 weeks later, Obama won a bunch of delegates at the Texas State Convention. Texas awarded additional delegates at the convention even though they'd already held a primary, which Hillary won. Texas is a strange state, and Texas Democrats are strange people. Maybe it's because they're an endangered species. The Texas win put Obama over the top. The primary game was over. When all the votes were counted, Barack had beaten Hillary by 0.1% out of more than 36 million votes cast. By then, John McCain had already secured the Republican nomination. He'd run away from the Mackinac Island crowd back in March. I started looking forward to the battle that was to come. I really liked both Obama and McCain, and it felt good to be able to decide who to vote for instead of who to vote against. Of course, I decided that I would vote for Obama because his politics were much more closely aligned with mine. But the prospect of a McCain win didn't bother me. Just like 2000, I decided that I was going to sit back and enjoy the show. But then something terrible happened. Something horrible. And the terrible, horrible something's name was Sarah Palin. It had taken me about 30 seconds to realize that a Cuban immigrant named Rosendo Estrada was a very intelligent man. It took me less than 30 seconds to realize that native-born Sarah Palin was an absolute moron. Dr. Rosendo Estrada immigrated to become an American asset. Sarah Palin was an American train wreck. She was vanilla. She was vacuous. She was vapid. There weren't enough derogatory V words to describe how dumb she was. Lipstick on a pig, or a pit bull, or a hockey mom, or whatever the hell it was that she said. It didn't matter. Everything that came out of her mouth was word salad. She was an idiot. I cursed John McCain. God love him, I cursed him. But then I softened a little. I understood why he did what he did. He was an old man up against a rock star, and he knew that he had no chance to win without a miracle. He threw a Hail Mary because he had to. But my God, what an errant pass it was. If he were to be elected, a semi-literate moron would be a 72-year-old heartbeat away from the presidency of the United States. A 72-year-old heart that had endured unspeakable torture in a Vietnam prison. I had to give McCain a bit of credit. Palin's appearance on the world stage created quite a sensation. All the nation's Joe's six-packs crushed on her. So did a lot of Jane's six-packs. Maybe they were all going to vote for her. Maybe she'd propel McCain into the White House and she'd come along for the ride. Under no circumstance could we risk letting this happen, I told my friends. Imagine Sarah Palin in a room with Vladimir Putin, I told them. He'd grind her into moose meat hamburger. I couldn't just sit back and watch it all happen without working to stop it. I needed to do something. I decided that I would volunteer to be a foot soldier in the Obama army. Because of the stupid Electoral College, working in Kentucky on a presidential campaign is a complete waste of time. Working in most states is just as pointless. Kentucky is too red. New York is too blue. The Electoral College's horse and buggy arithmetic means that in the current century, only a handful of voters in a handful of states get to pick the nation's president. And if you want to be of any use as a volunteer, you have to go work in one of those states. I decided to go to Ohio. If John Kerry had won Ohio in 2004, he'd have beaten George W. Bush in the Electoral College. He lost the popular vote by a little over 3 million, but if 59,301 Ohioans had flipped their levers the other way, John Kerry would have taken the oath of office in 2005. A month after our primary ended in May 2006, an article appeared in the magazine Rolling Stone that caused a bit of a sensation. The article's headline read, "Was the 2004 election stolen?" Republicans prevented more than 350,000 voters in Ohio from casting ballots or having their votes counted, enough to have put John Kerry in the White House. The article was written by Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. RFK Jr. started his article with this sentence, "Like many Americans, I spent the evening of the 2004 election watching the returns on television and wondering how the exit polls, which predicted an overwhelming victory for John Kerry, had gotten it so wrong." I had to admit that I was one of those Americans, except that I was watching election returns on a laptop instead of a TV. RFKJ continued, "Republicans derided anyone who expressed doubts about Bush's victory as nutcases in tinfoil hats." In his article, Kennedy raged against voting irregularities, shredded Democratic registrations, faulty voting equipment, suppression of overseas ballots, outright fraud. The list went on. Kennedy wrote a whole book about it. A lot of us started talking about Kennedy's allegations, and some of my Democratic cronies passed around a copy of Kennedy's book. But most credible journalists dismissed Kennedy's claims. There simply wasn't any evidence to support them, they said. Most of us accepted their analysis. It was only years later that we found out that RFK Jr. was one of those nutcases who wore a tinfoil hat. I signed up on the Obama campaign website and told him that I wanted to work in Columbus. I knew the town well. I'd done a lot of work there, and my cousin Susan Moore lived there. She was a guidance counselor for the Kahana School District on the south side of town. I'd go to Columbus, visit a client or two, hang out with my cousin, and ground pound for Barack. It would be fun. Soon I got a call from the Obama people. "How would you like to work in Indiana?" a woman asked me. "Indiana?" I asked back. "Are you crazy? He's got no chance to win in Indiana," I told her. Her answer gave me pause. "We have data that says otherwise," she said. Wow. I thought for a minute. Then I told her that I'd still rather go to Columbus. Cousins, clients, all of that. She said fine. I was assigned to work at a strip mall office in the Worthington Park neighborhood on the north side of town and less than a mile west of I-71 where it sliced through Columbus on its way to Akron. The drive from Louisville took about 3.5 hours. We were pretty busy at work and so I would have to shuttle back and forth a lot. Sometimes I could crash overnight at my cousin's place. Other times I had to travel up and back on the same day. When I had to do that, I flew there. With a little airplane, it only took me an hour and change to fly to Columbus. I always landed at OSU, Ohio State University Airport. I've been flying there for years to work for a client in the nearby Columbus suburb of Dublin. OSU was also less than a 15-minute drive from the Obama campaign office where I'd been assigned. I knew the airport well and I'd landed there many times. It was also the place where I'd come the closest to dying in an airplane. A few years earlier, when I had a meeting scheduled with our Dublin client, I decided to fly there in the morning rather than drive up the night before. I got up early, checked the weather, and decided that it was safe to go. There's no doubt that my decision was influenced by my need to get to the meeting. It was cold and the weather forecast wasn't particularly encouraging, but there were no reports of icing along my route. And it was going to be a short flight, I told myself. I took off from Louisville and climbed to 7,000 feet. I was in clear air and everything was fine until I approached Cincinnati. Just southwest of the city, I entered the clouds and I started picking up a little ice. It grew like linear stalactites along the leading edges of the wings. But it wasn't much and I didn't worry about it. Still, I asked for a lower altitude to get out of the clouds, but the Cincinnati controller couldn't accommodate me. His airspace was too crowded. On the radio, I started hearing a lot of chatter from other pilots asking for different altitudes. They were getting ice, too. Finally, I was cleared for a descent into Columbus, but I remained in the clouds. Flying in clouds is like painting the windows gray. You have no outside visual cues at all. You have to rely on the instruments in front of you to tell you where to go. You also have to rely on them to tell you which way is up, and to do that you have to learn to ignore the sensations in your butt and your inner ear because they'll lie to you. If you inadvertently enter a shallow turn, the mild centrifugal force will fool your body. What seems to be up is now actually a few degrees from the real vertical. If you keep ignoring your instruments and trusting your body, that error will increase. 30 degrees, 60 degrees, 90 degrees. It's insidious and it's deadly. Before long, you're upside down and spiraling out of control toward the ground. That's exactly what happened to JFK Jr. when he crashed into the ocean off Martha's Vineyard in 1999. To reach a runway when you're in the clouds, you generally follow an instrument that has two needles. One needle tells you whether or not you're aligned with the runway, and the other tells you whether you're above or below the proper glide path to get there. On my approach to Columbus, both needles were right where they were supposed to be, and when I broke out of the clouds, there was a big fat runway right in front of me. Then suddenly there was a big fat snowplow on the big fat runway right in front of me. Go around, the tower controller hollered over the radio. I had no choice. I had to go to climb power and head back up into the clouds, and back up into the ice. The Ohio State University Control Tower is not operated by the FAA. Instead, they contract the airport's control services to a private company. Maybe one of their new guys let the snowplow cut right in front of me. Maybe the snowplow operator was an idiot. Maybe both of those things were true. In any event, I had to circle around the field and line up for another attempt, and the weather was deteriorating rapidly. A strong wind was now blowing directly across the runway, and a driving snowstorm over the field brought visibility to near zero. To land an airplane using only instruments, you have to learn to make tiny, almost imperceptible control movements to stay on course. Too big of a control input and you overshoot your mark, making it difficult to recover. On my second attempt, I wasn't ready for the strong wind across the runway, and I was blown left of course. At the minimum allowable altitude of 200 feet above the ground, I was still left of course, and I couldn't see the runway. I couldn't see anything. The rules say that if you reach a point like that, you have to abort your landing attempt and try something else. I did, but now I was starting to get into real trouble. As I climbed higher into the clouds, I noticed that the control inputs I was making weren't having their usual effect on the airplane. The little plane didn't react the way that it normally did. I'd accumulated too much ice. And not just on the wings, there was obviously a great deal of ice on the control surfaces at the tail of the plane as well. I couldn't see it, but I didn't need to. I could feel it. I was now flying an ice cube. This kind of sucks, I told myself. It was a masterful understatement. I decided that I had no choice but to land at Ohio State on my third try, whatever it took. The plane wasn't going to stay airborne long enough for me to find another field. On the third try, I was ready for the wind, and the needles stayed right where they were supposed to. But when I got to the minimum altitude of 200 feet, I was still in the clouds. I saw nothing but a gray windshield. But I knew that I had to land. I knew the airport well, and I knew that even if I got a little off course, I wasn't going to bump into anything. I kept going lower and lower. Finally, at about 100 feet, I saw the ground. The airfield in front of me was a sea of white. There was no visible runway. Fortunately, the runway edge lights were sticking out of the snow just enough so that I could make them out, and I landed in a spot between them. I didn't even try to use the airplane's brakes, but I didn't need to. The plane was small, and the Ohio State runway was long. I'd made it, but I shouldn't have. I should have been dead. At the meeting in the client's office, I couldn't help but daydream about the alternate reality that almost was. There would be a question. Where's Jim? Wasn't he supposed to be here for this? And then a little article would appear in Louisville's Courier-Journal. Local man dies in Columbus light plane crash. And that would be it. When I flew to OSU to ground pound for Obama, I had no such problems. On all my flights I had good weather, and as I crossed the Ohio River near Cincinnati, I always looked down at the river and thought about the stupid Electoral College. The votes of the people who lived south of the river counted for nothing, I remember thinking, while the votes of the people who lived north of the river counted for everything. It didn't seem fair, because it wasn't fair. After my first flight, just for the lulls, I filed one of those silly CNN citizen journalist reports about what I was doing, and they published it. They thought that it was cool that a campaign volunteer was flying to his job. I grabbed a cheap rental car and headed to the strip mall. The office was packed with volunteers. Rows of them sat at folding tables, making phone calls. Others milled around whiteboards and carried big sheaths of paper. There was more energy in that campaign office than I'd ever seen before. The campaign had rented a second office next to the main office, and inside I saw several rows of tables where people sat, hunched over laptops. "Don't go in there," a guy warned me. "Who are they?" I asked. "Lawyers," he said. I was asked if I'd do some canvassing. Oi. "Sure," I said, "I'll do whatever you guys need to get done." I was randomly paired to walk some neighborhoods with an old guy named Joe DeCola, who turned out to be one of the most interesting humans I've ever met. Joe had grown up in Columbus, but now he was living in Manhattan. Like me, he'd realized that it was pointless to work on the Obama campaign in a state like New York, so he decided to go back to Columbus where his sister still lived. Joe was in his early 70s and retired, so he had time on his hands. It turned out that Joe had had quite a career. He'd worked as a news reporter for CBS 60 Minutes, a documentary producer at ABC, and as a producer at NBC. When Joe was in school, he told me, he became chairman of some chapter of the college Republicans. His last official act was to throw a birthday party for Dwight Eisenhower, he said. He got married and had a couple of kids. Now, a half-century later, he was a gay Democrat living in New York City. It was one hell of a metamorphosis. Joe had tons of fun stories to tell about the places he'd worked. Moscow, the Middle East. Joe had been everywhere. We quickly became buddies. However crazy the tinfoil hat rumors had been about Ohio in 2004, it was still clear that the voting process had not gone smoothly. There were long lines at too many polls, and at least some people gave up and went home without voting. There were too few voting machines, too few poll workers. Provisional ballots for problematic registrations gummed up the works. In response to all of that, in 2005, the Ohio legislature enacted early voting laws. Polling stations were opened all over Ohio, and people could start voting there almost a month before Election Day. Our canvassing job was to make sure that people knew about them. Obama campaign volunteers fanned out into dozens of Columbus neighborhoods and knocked on thousands of doors. Do you know about the polling stations, we asked. Do you know where they are? Do you know that you can go vote there right now? Do you need a ride? We talked to all kinds of people. Housewives, convicts, drunkards, and a lot of Maynards. On one suburban street corner, a thin white guy with beady eyes asked me what I was doing. When I told him, what he said back gave me chills. "That guy gets elected, he's going to get shot," said beady-eyed man. I stared at him for a second. Too many bad memories immediately flooded my mind. "Well," I told him, "I certainly hope not." I couldn't help but think that there was some dog-whistle racism in what beady-eyed man had said. I'd already heard my share of blatant racist comments about Obama, even among some Democrats. Too many N-words too often. One friend of my mother's, who was a staunch Democrat, told me bluntly, "No way I'm voting for that N-word." What she said disgusted me, but it also worried me. I wondered how many more of her there were. Back in Louisville, John Yarmouth was facing a rematch with Ann Northup. To get her revenge shot at Yarmouth, she'd had to fend off a challenge from 3 other Republicans in their primary. She'd easily beaten them, but she'd fallen just short of a majority win at 49%. As an incumbent, Yarmouth looked to be in a much stronger position to beat Ann than he had in 2006, so none of us worried much about his chances. Still, it was a spirited campaign, and I managed to watch John and Ann duke it out in one live debate. I decided that debates were a lot more fun to watch from the audience than they were from the podium. On the 23rd of October 2008, the Delta Queen docked at Louisville for its last ever visit. The ship had lost its special exemption to operate as a passenger liner, and it was destined for stationary duty somewhere, doing something other than being a magnificent steamboat. 3 sitting presidents had sailed on the Delta Queen: Herbert Hoover, Harry Truman, and Jimmy Carter. But its superstructure was made of wood, and that violated the safety rules of the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea. For years, the U.S. Congress had granted the Delta Queen an exemption, but the current agreement was about to expire, and the Congress now refused to grant another extension. There were rumors that unions were applying pressure on Congress to block the extension. They wanted to unionize the crew of the Delta Queen, the rumors said, but the steamship line that operated the sternwheeler resisted them. If the rumors were true, then the baby was being thrown out with the bathwater because the grand old Delta Queen was about to be decommissioned. There was a ceremony. The Delta Queen's captain handed over the golden antlers, which of course he'd won in the last race, to the captain of the Belle of Louisville. "For safekeeping," he said. Mayor Jair gave a little speech. The next day we went down to the riverfront docks to watch the Delta Queen steam away for the last time. She looked as magnificent as ever. As she made her way back up the river toward Cincinnati in the dusk, her steam calliope serenaded us. One last song. The sound of that calliope coming across the water was mournful, and it was beautiful. On the 4th of November 2008, I got up early and took off in the little plane to head to Columbus one more time. I'd cast an excused absence ballot in Louisville a few days earlier. I was going to be out of town on Election Day, I'd had to swear. The weeks before had been hectic. Lots of ground pounding, lots of door knocking. Our strip mall office wasn't Obama's Columbus campaign headquarters, but its presence generated a lot of buzz anyway. A journalist from the Associated Press showed up one day and asked if he could ride along with Joe and me while we canvassed neighborhoods. Sure, we told him, and my cousin Susan joined us. A few days later, we saw a little article about us on the AP Wire Service feed. David Muir from ABC News came to interview some of the people in the campaign office. Cynthia Nixon from Sex and the City showed up one day to shake hands with volunteers. It was a warm day, but she was wearing a fuzzy coat anyway. She looked pale and thin and tired and not terribly sexy. "Thank you for doing this," she said to me. I shook her hand and said thank you back for supporting us. She smiled a wan smile. Mine was probably the 500th hand she'd had to shake that day. All day long on Election Day, we ran around town pounding on doors. More convicts, more drunkards, and more Maynards. I stumbled on one group of very drunk people in the courtyard of a shabby apartment building. They were sitting in lawn chairs, and they had beer and whiskey bottles scattered all around them. It was early afternoon, but it was clear that they'd been at it for a while. "Need something?" they asked when they saw me. "No," I told them I was in the wrong place. But every other place I went, I implored everyone I saw, go vote, go vote, go vote. We were asked to check on polling stations, and we drove by them occasionally. We were given a number to call if we saw any problems. The number led to the room full of lawyers who were sitting in the office next door to ours. At the end of the day, I hopped in the little plane and flew back to Louisville to join my Democratic cronies at a downtown election night party. The first state to be called was Kentucky, of course, because of its dopey polling hours. Calling Kentucky made the score McCain 8, Obama nothing. But the old war hero's lead didn't hold for very long. In no time, it became obvious that it was going to be a big night for Obama, and for John Yarmouth. This time, he gave Ann Northup a thorough beatdown, 59-41. One of the guys in our office, Greg Galbraith, decided to take a shot at politics in 2008, but instead of swinging for the fence like I did, he made a much more realistic bid for the Kentucky State House of Representatives. He was unopposed in the Democratic primary, mostly because no Democrat wanted to run in his district. Unfortunately for Greg, he lived in a cheesecake-eating, gay-away-praying suburb whose district was heavily gerrymandered, and in the general election he faced a well-entrenched six-term Republican incumbent named Ron Krim. Greg got his ass kicked 63-37. But Greg didn't mind. He'd run a low-key campaign and he'd had fun doing it. We'd even had fun knocking on doors for him. And he said that Krim was a nice guy. They even did lunch together after their election was over. The first Tuesday evening in November of '08 was another blue wave night for Democrats. They picked up 21 more seats in the House and 8 more in the Senate, giving them large majorities in both houses. As 11 o'clock Eastern Time approached, it was obvious that Barack Obama had won the presidency. He was going to win big in California, of course, and when the polls closed there, the election would be called. He would eke out a win in Ohio by 4.5 points. And lo and behold, he'd win Indiana too, by less than 0.6 of a point. His team's data had been accurate. Just before the polls closed in California, I talked to my sister. Well, she said, I guess I'll just have to get used to the fact that Obama is going to be president for the next 4 years. Like my mother, she'd become a rabid Rush Limbaugh Republican. Maybe something happened to Ohio River water by the time it reached Paducah, I thought. I missed my mother that night, terribly, more than usual. I just wanted to hear her voice. I wanted to hear it betray her fears that the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse were back in town. But her voice had been silenced. A few months earlier, I'd infiltrated a conservative website that claimed Northwest Ohio as its territory. I can't remember its name, and it probably doesn't exist anymore anyway, but it doesn't matter. I hopped on the site's message boards, and I tried to convince its members that Sarah Palin represented a clear and present danger to the United States. This wasn't about ideology, I told them. It was about basic competence and dangerous incompetence. Like most of those websites back then, it was run by some young guy who jealously guarded his little online kingdom. He obsessed over posts, and he always sniffed out the IP addresses of posters. I never bothered to mask my IP address. I saw no reason to. When he saw that I'd posted a couple of times from Canada, he decided that I was some kind of a professional troll, and he attacked me. He did his best to dox me. He looked me up in the Internet Domain Registry. Look at all the websites this guy has, he told the folks on his message board. There's even one called Xeloda Killed My Mother, he wrote. I reached out to him and I convinced him that I was just a normal guy, trying to do what I thought was right. I told him what Xeloda had done to my mother. He backed down and apologized. He was sorry, he said, for what had happened to her. I told him not to worry about it, but then I asked him to do me a favor. To do my mother a favor. If your mother's still around, I said to him, please go call her. Right now. Tell her that you love her. She never gets tired of hearing it, and you only get so many chances in this life to say it. I hope that anyone who comes across these words does the same thing if they can. Right now. In memory of Helen Mary Moore, 1924 to 2007.